Afternoon, everybody. I can see that more people are kind of joining the virtual room, but I'll get started so we can kick off on time and get through the introductions and housekeeping as people continue to join. Thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Katie Jacobs from the CIPD, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the second in this webinar series that we hope will help you as people professionals continue to tackle racism in the workplace and help you to keep anti-racism on the business agenda, even as our news cycle continues to move on a bit. So hopefully some of you watched our previous series on racism and the challenges for HR. If you missed that, please do go back and watch it because it really was a fantastic series, loads of great stuff in there. You can find it on the CIPD website. In our first session of this new series, we covered how the people profession could go about obtaining long-term leadership commitment to anti-racism work and embed genuine cultural change. In this session, we are switching our attention to public policy, and in particular, ethnicity pay reporting. Joining me to discuss this topic, delighted that we have a really stellar panel. So we've got Dr. Doyin Atewologun. She's a chartered business psychologist, an expert in leadership, inclusion and intersectionality, and newly appointed Dean of the Rhodes Scholarships at the Rhodes Trust. We've got Baroness Ruby McGregor-Smith. She's a noted business leader, president of the British Chamber of Commerce, and author of the influential Race in the Workplace and the McGregor-Smith Review, which recommended that companies be compelled to publish ethnicity pay data. That was a few years ago, so we can discuss what, if anything, has changed. And last but not least, Peter Cheese, Chief Executive of the CIPD, who I expect that all of us know by now. So I will say needs no fuller introduction than that. Thank you so much for joining us today. As ever, I'm just going to run through our very quick housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded. You will be able to access it afterwards. To submit questions, and please do submit questions because we want this to be as interactive as possible. Please use the Q&A tab, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. Use the Q&A tab for questions that you want directed to the panel, but I would encourage you to use the chat function to speak to and connect with each other. It's always really great to see the chat afterwards and the kind of comments that have been made and the connections that have been made on there. So I would encourage you to comment as we go along on anything you hear that you find interesting and to form a bit of connection with each other. The CIPD has developed a new hub on our website dedicated to tackling racism in the workplace. We're adding resources to that all the time, so do check it out. I want to flag our wellbeing helpline for members in the UK and Ireland. With award-winning workplace wellbeing provider Health Assured, we are now providing CIPD members with free help and support via sessions with qualified therapists online or over the phone. And finally, I wanted to flag our reward management survey, which this year includes questions on the impacts of the Black Lives Matter movement on reward strategy. Please do fill that out if you're responsible for or have any influence over reward strategy in your organisations, and you can find that via our various social media channels. So that's enough of the housekeeping, on to the topic at hand. According to 2019 data from the Bank of England, people from ethnic minority backgrounds earn about 10% less in the UK than their white counterparts. We also know that those from ethnic minorities find it harder to achieve senior leadership positions. Only 1.5% of leadership positions in the UK are held by Black people, for instance. Currently, according to Business in the Community, only 11% of companies are voluntarily capturing their ethnicity pay gap data. Is mandatory ethnicity pay reporting one lever to achieving racial equality in UK workplaces? What would its introduction mean for organisations? And what are the other public policy levers we could pull to improve racial equality in UK workplaces? So that's the kind of thing we're going to be discussing this afternoon. Please do get your questions and comments in. But first off, I'd like to ask each of our panel to introduce themselves a bit more fully and offer some opening thoughts on the current context, racial inclusion in UK workplaces, and where change is most sorely needed. So Ruby, could I ask you to start, kick us off?
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today. In 2017, did a review on race in the workplace, and my recommendations clearly laid out a number of things that businesses could do to improve the participation of individuals from a minority background. We all know in business that there are a very, very small number of levers you can ultimately pull when you want real change. We also know, therefore, that in order to get real change, we have to start with data and understand where we are today. So my review called very heavily for publishing ethnicity pay gap data in some way, shape or form. And we know since then that the gender pay gap data has started a different set of conversations in organisations. It also called for aspirational targets. It also called for sponsorship and a number of other measures. But I think certainly my big message is, until we do what I recommended and what others have recommended in many reviews over the year, and we start taking action, things just won't change. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruby. Doyin.
Thanks, Katie. Good afternoon, everyone. Like Katie said, my background is in leadership, inclusion, and diversity. And I've also been, since its inception, academic advisor to the Parker Review. And in reflecting for today, I thought as part of my opening remarks, I should share a few ideas with regards to thinking about the value of the practice of mandatory ethnic pay gap reporting. I say let's focus on the practice because I think it's very easy for us to think policy and to separate ourselves from that. As individuals, we might hear that. As managers, leaders, people working in teams, and think, you know what, with regards to ethnicity pay gap reporting, that's something for the government, that's something for industry leaders, and it's not necessarily something that I can see myself working in. I think the other advantage of paying attention to mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting is whether or not you're making progress in it, it has the benefit of helping us focus on the system. So in addition to the potential risk of disconnecting from policy, I think just the concept of having mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting makes it real by turning us to attend to the systems in which we find ourselves and giving us particular goals to work on. And what I wanted to do in this time was to share a few examples. So just by way of context setting, we know that a historical perspective on present-day inequalities tells us that we are immersed in a hierarchical system in which institutions were originally created and favored particular types of people with status, privilege, and power. And we know today that management and senior level positions are in some ways protected with regards to their access to wealth, quality, education, and career trajectories. So we know that those positions have been duly compensated and protected as a result of historical inequalities. That context helps us have a systemic view on pay disparity. But in order to make it real, to make it personal, the concept of mandatory ethnic pay gap reporting quantifies it. And that we know from the psychology research helps us make this goal achievable. Goals facilitate a disciplined approach to change. Goals give us interim milestones. Goals give us a sense of urgency. We know that just having a quantifiable data point is an extremely effective way for organizational and individual change. And so at one level, I ask our audience to think, you know what, yeah, you might think this is not something I can actually kind of focus on right now with regards to my power, but having the conversation and aspiring to figures gives you an insight into where you want to get to. I also want to advocate a personal perspective on this because, like I said, senior leaders have a personal role in actually working towards reducing pay gaps. And so we know, for example, and we can probably discuss this more in the discussion, that, for example, processes such as mentoring and sponsorship, they happen all the time, they happen informally. We know that it's important in order to get senior level talent that we need to engage in mentoring and sponsorship. And so there are questions I would ask of senior leaders kind of listening on the call with regards to the effort they put in to sponsor, back, advocate, to put their neck on the line for people who don't look like them, for higher grades and for lucrative projects. And so I just offer some of these thoughts to say, yes, it's important absolutely for us to think about mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting as policy, but I also very much want to introduce the conversation around each listener on this call having a role to play in this. I'm very happy to expatiate further as the discussion continues. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doyin. And over to you, Peter.
Yeah, thank you, Katie, and good afternoon to everybody. First of all, real pleasure to have Ruby and Doyin on this conversation. They bring a lot of credibility, a lot of insight to this whole discussion. And to begin with Katie's thoughts, I think there's no doubt in our mind, and we've been, I think, quite strong on this as the CIPD, that now is the time for real action on more fairness, more transparency around ethnicity. We've talked about diversity and inclusion in all its aspects for a very long time, and so that is a central pillar of good and responsible business to show what they're doing to create inclusive cultures and workplaces for all. And of course, ethnicity has been one of those more challenging ones, and there's no doubt that with the killing of George Floyd, that has accelerated the anger and concern amongst so many about the lack of progress and action in creating fairer and more inclusive workplaces for people of ethnic minorities. So we have also come out and said that not only been involved in the government consultations and ethnic pay gap reporting, but in supporting the work that came out of Ruby's review, but also that we really do want to encourage this to now move forwards into more legislation. But I think there are some real challenges as well. There's no doubt about it. If we go back to gender pay gap reporting, I mean, what we found is that you think that's probably a simpler thing to do in some ways. There was still a reaction from, I thought, too many organizations saying, oh, this sounds rather complicated and how are we going to do it? And my reaction at the time often was, well, isn't this something we should have been doing anyway? Ethnic pay gap reporting definitely has additional levels of complexity on it, and understanding what is meant within the different categories and how far we go with understanding different ethnic groups within our organizations is part of that debate. But I think also, as Doyin has touched on, there's no doubt that regulation and policy can take you some way. And as Ruby said, I think both the gender pay gap and ethnic pay gap reporting, it puts it more clearly on the agenda. It makes business leaders pay attention to it. It makes external stakeholders pay more attention to this stuff, including investors in business. But it is not sufficient of its own. And even with gender pay gap, we found that arguably too many organizations see it as a compliance issue. And I'll give you, for instance, as to why that might be the case. If you're reporting a number with no narrative and no action plan related to it, then you're rather left with the conclusion as an external reader that you're just ticking a compliance box. And we know in order to drive these agendas, it's a lot more than that. It is how you shift your cultures and all those other things. So alongside any kind of pay gap reporting, we also need to see more transparency on action plans, the narrative behind what organizations understand from the data. Because at the end of the day, use another aphorism, data is only as good as what you understand it to be. So in other words, it's the insights that you drive from it. And that will be something that we've been emphasizing both for gender pay gap reporting, but we'll certainly be emphasizing and calling for more in policy terms, is more need for organizations to give narrative and action plans about what they understand of the pay gaps and what they're going to do about it. But as I said, I think it is also this link into the wider transparency of organizations on a number of dimensions to show how we're truly tackling inclusion in all its aspects, culturally and otherwise, within our organizations.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks all of you for those great introductions. I wanted to start by digging into the why a little bit, and then we can go on to the how. So Ruby, you mentioned that mandatory pay reporting was something you recommended pretty strongly in the review. Could you explain a little bit about why you think it matters so much?
I recall when I did my review in 2017, we wrote to the FTSE 100 and asked for them to explain what their breakdown of employees was by pay and by background. And of the companies that responded, of which 84 did, only 49 actually have meaningful data on their workforces. And I think that challenge in its own right is that if you actually don't know the issues around pay in the workplace, you've never analysed it, then how can you ever do anything about it? And when we took a look at the data that was submitted, we found that pretty much across every sector in the FTSE that did respond, that if you were of a minority background and you were working for the organisation, you might get promoted once or maybe twice, but you certainly didn't get promoted any more than that. And after about 2 levels of promotions, the numbers started to fall off a cliff. And when you take a look across the FTSE, there are so few people of a senior level of a BAME background. And until you understand why, and until you measure it, I think it's incredibly difficult to put a plan of action around it. Because you can say, we can change, we can run unconscious bias training, we can tell everyone to behave differently, we can tell everyone we can look at our recruitment processes, we can look at all these things, but you need to know if you're having any success and if there's going to be any breakthrough in your numbers. Particularly, I think, when you take a look around the country, for many organisations, particularly if you're employing people from some of our larger cities, with Birmingham, say, who have an ethnicity number, say, of over 50% is BAME of their population, you just don't see that at senior levels of business, and in Birmingham alone. And you sort of go, well, what's stopping that? And so I think unless we do it, and clearly I've recommended to everyone to sign up very much to the Race at Work Charter that's been launched by Business in the Community, and every organisation that does has committed to publishing their ethnicity pay gap. But until you do, and until the government chooses to legislate, we're never going to know our starting point, and we're just going to keep talking about theory and not action, is my view.
And given like that was back in a few years ago, so 49, less than half of the FTSE 100 were reporting anything. I mean, Doyin, any thoughts on why? Is it just put in the too difficult box, or is it because it's a sense of something that we don't value as important?
Yeah, there is often there's a fear linked to name and ethnicity. So many more of us know this now. Lack of race confidence, poor race fluency, a desire for colorblindness, while kind of denying these differential outcomes within your organization as well as more broadly in society. So, I mean, I am encouraged, and I hope Peter and Baroness Ruby are as well, by recent events, which at least give us a little bit more of a permission to use the R word. So I think there's a little bit more confidence, and there's some momentum to draw on that. And recently the signatures asking for mandatory ethnic pay gap reporting, they jumped quite a bit and got to over 100,000 now, and I'm sure that's very closely linked to Black Lives Matter. So there is a fear, but that is easing. And I really want to kind of reinforce what Baroness Ruby said, where we say, like, there's something around, there's a power in sitting down and having to be faced with the numbers. There is something in humanity, in terms of how we're wired, that gives us a drive, that gives us a goal. And really, if that's just the one thing that, or there is some indicator of progress that we want to make, for those reasons, I would say it's certainly worth engaging in that practice for many good reasons, but at that basic level, it gives us an impetus.
Thank you. And Peter, do you think it's something that you see our profession, so the people profession, pushing and being open to? So it is, as you said, it is, a lot of businesses view it as quite challenging.
Yeah, I think it's a question how much our profession is pushing this enough, if I'm honest. I mean, as we've all acknowledged, the progress has been very slow. I mean, 11%, we're not even at a tipping point. And I think, you know, business, they look to each other, don't they, in so many different ways. And if they could see a majority of organizations reporting on this clearly, then they would feel the obligation to do the same. So I think it's a combination of effects. I think that is one. How do you get to the tipping point? And I think we're all saying that to get to that tipping point, you've really got to push this into the more mandatory space. I think there's also an honest truth, which is, as we've all touched on, the visibility that organizations have had, the ethnic makeup of their organizations has been lacking for far too long. And as I said, if organizations were feeling a bit challenged in getting the data around gender pay gap, then it's a lot harder on ethnic pay gap. And one of the indicators that I look for is that, so the first thing is you've got to know what the ethnicity of your people are, and you've got to ask them. Now, even that question is not straightforward. I mean, there are different ways you can define it. People worry about just a general categorization of BAME because that doesn't tell you enough, and some people, and it doesn't tell you enough is the honest truth, and some people don't even like those sorts of designations. But the point is that if you do not understand it, or if you ask your people and they're not prepared to tell you their ethnic background, then that tells you something else. It tells you that the people in the organization don't even particularly want to talk about this. So, and I think, you know, the sad truth is there are many organizations still in that kind of place. So maybe HR team saying, well, it's difficult to get the data, and that's the reason why I might resist it. When actually what it's pointed to is your sheer difficulty in getting the data is pointing to some other things. The people are not feeling safe in your organization to talk openly about race. So I think we're all in the same place. We've been on this for a while. We're going to have to push harder. I think the government will introduce more mandatory reporting on this almost certainly. And that is going to be a challenge. And we should be prepared as a profession for that to happen. We should be on top of this data. And if we're finding our people aren't willing to share their ethnicity, then we've got to dig into that and understand why and address those issues alongside all of it.
Thank you. And mentioning that you're pretty sure that the government has appetite to introduce this. Ruby, any insight on if you think this is going to come in as mandatory, especially given all the other stuff that government and businesses are dealing with right now?
I think it will at some stage. I don't know when. I don't think they've really said very much about when or their thoughts. And clearly, in this current environment, I think there's some initial focuses which mean that this is not high up the list, but it's so important. And I also think we should think really clearly that once we're through this pandemic, in whatever shape or form we are, as businesses start to rebuild out of where they are today, and clearly many are challenged, it's a good time for them to think about it and think about what they can introduce. So you can start to build back different forms of businesses, and you build this into the structures as you start to grow again. Because one of my concerns is there's never a right time. In the middle of a pandemic, many would argue is not the right time. But I think as we start to come out of it, it needs to be on the list of things to do.
Thank you. And Doyin, any thoughts on that and it becoming mandatory? Something you see in the near future?
I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic about it. Yeah. But Katie, can I come in on one of the questions that's been raised in the chat? I don't know whether it was in response to one of the comments I made about, I think it was Dorothy, I might have missed the first name, saying my life isn't a tick box, you know, it isn't one for tick boxing. And I just wanted to clarify that when I was saying that this is something that spurs people into action, it really wasn't that at all. It wasn't, there's no expectation that this is tick box. Actually, it's a kickstart into real data. And just one illustration of that, you also commented on my work and intersectionality. So one organization I worked with a little while ago was looking at a version of ethnicity pay gap reporting, and they noticed that broadly speaking, that there wasn't as much of an ethnicity pay gap as they expected between white employees and Black employees. They looked at pay, there wasn't too much of a mix, there wasn't too much of disparity, and they looked at Black and there wasn't that much of a disparity. And then from an intersectional perspective, they sliced it by gender as well. So they they looked at their data on white men and women and looked at their data on Black men and women. And they realized that what was distorting the pay gap was there was a number of Black men who were in London and very highly paid. So what was happening when we asked a number of different questions of the data was a number of Black men for their grade were on really high salaries, but the white men in that grade didn't stay as long at that level, were promoted much more quickly. And so what that particular inquiry revealed to this organization was there was an indication, potentially, that Black men's careers were being stalled through bonus and extra pay, and white men were flying through their careers. And so I've just used this as an illustration to say when we take mandatory ethnic pay gap reporting seriously, and we add, if we want to, an intersectional lens, it actually gives us additional data to pinpoint where some of our challenges might lie.
That's a really great example. I think that ties into what Peter said in his opening comments about not enough to just kind of slap a number on it, but really interrogate the data, look at the stories that it's telling you, and put forward a proper action plan. Got some questions coming through. I'm going to park them for now, but I will come to them shortly. So please do continue to get them in, and don't do that thing where you all put them in at 1:25 and then I can't answer any of them.
Hi.
We'll get annoyed.
Yeah, not bad. Good.
Last little bit.
Don't forget, you need to mute yourself.
Yeah, how did that happen?
That's just
That's one of my colleagues who's in the background, so sorry about that. I wanted to ask, before I move on to some audience questions, about the comparison between what we've seen happening with gender pay gap reporting and ethnicity pay gap reporting. So Ruby, any reflections on how that's kind of changed the game? Do you think it's raised the level of conversation at board level?
I think it has. I think what happens now is that when you talk about the gender pay gap, it's a board level question. And before we had the gender pay gap, yes, we've been talking about women for a long, long time, but no one's talked about closing down pay gaps. And that's the big issue we've all got on race as well. So it's going to take time to close the gender pay gap, but it's not about saying everything needs to be done today because it can't. This may take many, many years to start really changing. And every organisation has to do what's right for them. But I think it has started a proper set of conversations on the gender pay gap, not just for boards, but also for employees, because you've got to start to question why some of these pay gaps are so high. You know, for some industries, you would expect them to be high because of history, because of the way the workforce has always been structured. But as that changes, it isn't about being critical. It's about saying, look, we can do this because it's the right thing to do, and economically, it's the right thing to do for organisations and for the government. So therefore, let's put in the measures that will really, really help. And you know, when we talk about women, it then leads on to that conversation about, does that mean more flexibility? Does it mean more mentoring? Does it mean more sponsorship? Do we have to remember that if there are no senior women in our organisation, that culturally that may not be working too? What do we need to do about that? But the conversations start, and then action plans start to get developed, and that has to be the route we take with ethnicity pay gap as well.
And Peter, any thoughts on how you've seen kind of the conversation around gender pay gap change, and specifically around narrative and action plan?
Yeah, I'd echo what Ruby said. I think it has changed the narrative and discussion, as you said, Ruby, with boards, with investors, with other stakeholders, prospective employees starting to look at this kind of data from an organization saying, what's the story telling me? And as I said, I think transparency in all these dimensions of workforce is so important. It's incredible when you think back over the history of corporate reporting, where there's been so little transparency in any aspect of workforce. And yet these are the things that prospective employees want to see. They're also the lead indicators. I mean, let's not forget the context of this. This is about inclusive, responsible businesses who are open to recruiting all of the people that they need, broadening their mindsets, reflecting their customer base, and all these other things. And as Ruby said, reflecting the communities which they're part of. And yet we've done such a bad job in reporting so much of this. So I think gender pay gap was a very strong signal from government that they are going to start to take this stuff more seriously. As I said, I think it's been picked up by investors, amongst others, in this wider debate of what's known as ESG, so environmental, social, and governance questions. And I think also during all this lockdown, we've seen so many organizations saying this is putting people at the front and center of the agenda. So now really is a time to progress this, but we need to. So what are the lessons we've also learned from gender pay gap? And as I said, I think that the number one, well, the 2 points are, which we've already made to some degree. One is, yes, it's put it more on the agenda, but secondly, we have got to get deeper in our understanding of what the number says. And what is our story behind it? What's our action plan that leads it? And I can see a comment on the chat line about, does HR as a profession need to up its game in terms of analytics? And the answer is yes. And we are doing a lot as the CIPD to do that, because it isn't just the raw data, it's what other insights is it telling you. And finally, I'd make an example, because when you see a big gender pay gap, and I think it's true also of the ethnicity stuff, when you see a big gap, you think, oh my goodness, this is terrible, so I'm probably going to hide it or try to write some story about it. Whereas actually the first thing is to understand what it is. And if you're in an organization, let's take gender, which has a very high number of people joining in the lower ranks as women, so say in the fashion industry, then it's going to take a long, long time, and you could take some pretty abnormal actions to try to fix it in the short term, if that's what you think you need to do. So for example, hiring loads of young men into an organization, which is predominantly in an industry which of course is going to attract women. So lots of complexities of that nature, which is why we need to get the insights to back it up. And I think what we've learned from gender pay gap is we've still got some work to do even on that before we get to ethnic pay gap reporting as well.
Thank you. I just want to read out a comment, which is back to Doyin about the point you were making about tick boxing, that the attendee wasn't disagreeing with you, just saying that as a woman of colour, I'm tired of being used to satisfy quotas or satisfy tick boxes, with very little being done to promote change or rearrange the landscape for me or other Black people in the workforce. It needs to move beyond talk to policies, from talk and policies and onto action, which I think is what we were saying. So I want to come on a little bit to kind of how you do it, because that's what a lot of the questions from practitioners are coming in. And Doyin, would an ethnicity pay gap report look identical as a calculation to the gender pay gap one, or are there different ways of doing it? How would you advise that it's done?
Broadly speaking, that the steps would be similar. Just a couple of challenges which we've already kind of hinted at. One of the things which we'll come back to, I'm sure, is about categorization and self-identification. So I'll come back to that. But once we have the data around categorization and or self-identification, is a significant plea to break BAME down into different categories. Black, Asia, BAME, Black, Asian, minority, ethnic. So I put BAME in air quotes because I know not everyone identifies with that term. So one of the ways in which it is a little bit more complicated is we have many more debates about ethnic identification today relative to different gender identities. I don't want to, this is not about one versus the other, but there's something about really tuning into, for example, the fact that Chinese men earn very differently to Bangladeshi women, for example. Just to go back to the question of self-identification and categorization, I know there have been a couple of comments around that. Broadly speaking, knowing that this is an ongoing process, so regular reminders, quarterly reminders, rather than, there was someone who talked about launching an initiative in January that I saw in the Q&A on the chat, this isn't a long game, like I think we've mentioned once or twice already. So the organizations where I've seen the self-identification numbers go up, they have engaged in an ongoing campaign. They have been really clear on why they need this data. They have really been really clear on the relationship between the organizational values and strategy and why they are asking people to self-identify, report on their ethnicity, and they have communicated progress. So this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing, this is why it's important, this is how we're using our data, and repeat, and repeat. Some listeners might be familiar with a particular report. I'm just going to highlight it because there's a really good case study in it by Nationwide. So the Black British Business Awards did the middle research, which I led a few years ago. I think it's 2017. If you just Google the Black British Business Awards and the middle research, the study will come up, and there's a case study towards the end that talks about how Nationwide went up from something like below 20% to something like above 70% following some of these steps.
Thank you. And Ruby, can I ask you to add on that and maybe reflecting on those businesses that you've said are doing it voluntarily via the BITC commitment there? What is working in terms of the how? How are they reporting?
Look, I think we have to accept that it's a difficult thing to report on, particularly if you don't have that many people self-declaring. But I take a view that you've got to work with the data you've got. So when I was running my tea, we had 1% compliance, and that was fine. You know, my view was let's report on the numbers you've got and gradually you'll build it as people get to trust it more. And clearly I can see why some people would be uncomfortable and ask, well, why do we need to do this? But it's, to my point, until we've got data, we can't do anything. And I think it's going to be different for different organisations, but I think there is a tendency to overcomplicate it because people don't want to do things until it's perfect. It's not going to be perfect. The gender pay gap reporting is difficult enough, right? That was difficult enough to put in place. There's been lots of imperfections in even doing that. This is going to be difficult, but it shouldn't stop people doing it. I also think if people start to do it voluntarily, even with huge numbers of caveats about their data, at least it's a starting point. Now, I know that one of the issues is going to be that a lot of people won't want to publish it because they'll go, well, hang on, our data's really bad. Well, everyone's data's really bad. We should just accept it's all bad and that no one's going to look good coming out of this. And that isn't the point. The point is, how do we change where we are when we know it's really poor, and just accept it's going to be pretty dire. And then it's how you build on it. And the more I think you look at it, and the thing is whatever you go and report in year one, you can change the way you report in future years if you don't think it's good enough. It's not that we have to be wedded to the number of people, the different backgrounds, only this subgroup this year. I think it gets overcomplicated. It just would be good to report something, whatever it is. And even if boards and organisations start to change it a year or two later, so be it. And if you take a look at those that have, they're all doing it differently. They've all got different interpretations. I'm not bothered about that because every industry might argue it's right and we shouldn't be going for some kind of global, amazing, you know, this is how we do it, because it will be different by industry. It will be different by those that go into different industries. I mean, I had a great conversation with the big four accounting firms where they told me we don't really have many issues from, say, the Asian community. And I said, well, you know, I can speak for that because I did chartered accountancy. It was something I was really pushed into as a profession. I said, you know, that and lots of my family were also pushed into it as into a profession, but they knew about it and they thought it could open some doors. The reality is, but you will have a challenge with some other individuals from a background who wouldn't consider that A, they could go and join you, and B, that you would support them. So, and there's only, say, for example, one of the big four has only got one black partner. So let's be honest about this. There are so many different ways of looking at it, but you've got to go with what you know and expect change each year. And let's not get too theoretical. We just need to report something.
And how do you get over, we had a few people asking about the fear factor, that so maybe people aren't reporting because they're scared of what they'll find or they're worried about looking bad. I mean, do you think just put it out there and deal with it?
Yes, of course, all of that's true. Let's be really honest about this. Why would anyone want to report something that doesn't look great? Okay, that's fine. It's not going to look great. We all need to get over that. We can't solve this unless we're prepared to deal with that one point. And the idea that everyone goes, no, we can't publish poor data. We'll work for a few more years to make things better, and then we'll publish it when it's good, won't achieve a thing. We need to publish data as our starting point. And we all know what gets measured gets dealt with in business. It's as simple as that. And the mere idea that we're going to go around in circles on nice, soft initiatives, well, as I said in 2017, we're kind of done all of that, and we need to stop doing it. And we need to stop being unnerved by what it's going to look like. And I also feel that although employees may be unnerved by it, and do we push for it? Push for it, because at the end of the day, until we start talking about this in organisations and talk about the data and talk about what we're going to do and start to talk about race, which clearly so many people still feel uncomfortable about talking about, until we do all those things, nothing will change, and we'll still be having webinars in a decade saying exactly the same thing. And I'm not sure we all want to be on them in a decade without progress.
Thank you. Really great call to action there about being brave. And just to flag, a few people asking in the chat about the source that Doyin quoted, and we put that in the chat now. Peter, I know you mentioned this earlier, but we've had quite a few questions about disclosure, and how, have you got any advice on how to kind of get that disclosure up? Because a lot of people feel that they just don't know enough about their employees in the first place.
Yeah, I think Doyin made some very important points on this, and indeed Ruby as well. That first of all, the data will never be 100% accurate. I think one of my indicators, as I said, is how many people are prepared to answer the question, and there could be various reasons why they may not. and the worst being that they're just simply not comfortable exposing, or talking about it because the organisation is not comfortable talking about race. But it could also be these other things, and a couple of people I see commented on it. If you just keep asking me the same damn question, I keep filling in the same data request, and nothing changes, why would I keep doing it? So I think this is so important that we've got to show that the data won't be perfect, but we're using it for these reasons, and then demonstrate the action that you're taking as a result, which also brings us back to the points we've all made, which is about having insight and the narrative behind it. And I agree, Ruby, I don't think the data will ever be perfect. What worries me a little bit, and I think we saw it even with gender pay gap, is we don't want to give a license for people to massage numbers. I mean, there was a great series of articles when the gender pay gap first came out in the FT, because some organizations have started to report a 0 mean and median difference in their gender pay. And the FT, in a very FT kind of way, said, look, just for the avoidance of doubt, this is how you calculate a mean, and this is how you calculate a median. And the fact that those two numbers could be the same thing, and particularly 0 in their language, is highly unlikely. So, but we have the means to challenge, right? I mean, if organizations put out stuff that doesn't look realistic, we have the means to challenge them. The employees can challenge them. It's why I'm really keen on this sort of multi-stakeholder idea of modern business, which says, so we should all have some voice in this. And of course, it's not just a regulatory thing. It's investors and financial stakeholders, it's employees and prospective employees, it's customers and others all saying to organizations, well, you think you're doing a great job, your data seems to sell this, you're not telling the story straight. So I think it's part of a wider shift that we've got to have in a more open debate about all these aspects of responsible business, of which regulatory and policy reporting we're all agreeing is part.
Thank you. And Ruby, I think you wanted to make a point there as well.
I just think we know that we're going to get low levels of self-declaration to begin with. We're going to get organisations making themselves look better than they are. In some cases, we're going to get those that just put it all out there and go, we are going to get a whole mixture. But until we do it, we're never going to know what we're going to get. So we need to kind of do it. And then every year we can start to go, well, that bit didn't work. We can change it and we'll get better. But until we do, I don't think any organisation has the right narrative to say, you can't say we're an equal opportunities employer, that we provide the opportunities for everyone equally, when we already know the gender pay gap in some organisations is truly appalling, the ethnicity pay gap will be, let alone when we get onto the challenges around disability and other challenges in the workplace. It's not equal, it's not even, but because we can't decipher it, we can't put interventions in place that work. And so it's not just about data, it's about the entire management of what you're prepared to do with the subject. And I just think you can be really authentic about this, stand up and go, we'll publish it, even if it looks dire, we'll put in some action plans and report against them and hold ourselves to account. We'll expect our investors to hold us to account. We'll change our incentive plans to hold us to account. We are serious about it. And I think employees would be over the moon that was a group of people that wanted to do it. But at the moment, all the stuff we've done so far clearly doesn't work. Okay, all the nice words, all the, we'll mentor, we'll do it just isn't going to cut through. So we do the serious stuff first. We need to do all those other things as well, but we need to have a plan based around data at the heart of it that says this is where we are and this is where we're going to get to. And if that's going to take us a decade, it may take us a decade, but honesty would be a really good thing.
And I think for you, Ruby, and also for you, Doyin, maybe I'll come to you first. What appetite do you see from the senior leaders that you work with to be brave and to, because this is a senior leader agenda, we're talking about a kind of Execo board agenda here. So, Doyin, what appetite do you see to be brave and to go for it?
Not enough. As Baroness Ruby was speaking, I was thinking about the work we did for the FRC as part of the Parker Review this year. And we looked at, myself and a number of colleagues looked at the quality of ethnicity reporting. So essentially how the FTSE 350 was responding to the Parker Review. And, so we're having conversations around courage. We're having conversations about just kind of getting out there, being explicit, being direct, understanding that we are not going to be perfect, which I completely advocate. But I'm just thinking two related experiences from that piece of work that we found quite discouraging. One was the active work, it seemed, to avoid using race, naming race. Race was obfuscated and conflated with nationality, with culture, with all other words. So a FTSE 350 firm that kind of says it's responding to the Parker Review, then talking about diversity of nationality and geography, shows that they're not quite there yet. The other thing, which we've kind of touched on, but I really want to emphasize, is this statement. We found too many FTSE 350 companies would say something along the lines of, well, yes, we are an equal opportunities, employer, but, we're not going to lower our standards because meritocracy is important. Of course, they didn't quite use those terms, but there was too often a conflation between the notion of diversity being just a little bit too much to ask for because we are meritocracies. And that's a myth, that's a fallacy, that actually in order for me to be diverse, I actually need to sacrifice on my talent levels. But that narrative was perpetuated over and over and over again. So before we even get to a point where an organization is like, you know what, yeah, let's record the ethnicity pay gap. Let's commit, let's go out there. I think there are some really basic things that even just at the level of putting in your annual reports, don't dance around race. Don't, kind of throw off this myth that, in order for you to be diverse, you're making some sort of compromise. In actuality, evidence that you're not a merit-based organization is in homogeneity. The fact that everyone looks the same suggests that it's not based on a meritocracy. It's quite the opposite. So just a few comments in terms of how much work needs to be done.
And Ruby, same question to you, but maybe to throw in a question that's come from the audience about any advice you can give to organisations that are fearful. Kind of Doyin mentioned a bit of a fear factor there about even talking about race.
God, I think we've all been scared about talking about race. I only started talking about it 3 years ago. I hate talking about having to talk about why I'm different. I mean, look, it's a real challenge. And I think in the end, you just have to take the plunge and go, do you know what? We're going to have to start to have these conversations properly, or nothing will change. We'll just skirt around the issue. But it is hard. And the best way, I think, is, I mean, I got Business in the Community to write a small guide on how you talk about race, because so many organizations don't even really like to discuss it. But I think, and for some reason, it's been easier to talk about women for so many years. But I think we've got no choice but to tackle it. So until we're prepared to discuss it, nothing will change. And so I think in the last 3 years, there has been quite a lot of conversations about it with organizations. But we keep coming back to, if you want to change things, put a plan together of the things you're going to do that are right for your organization. And, you know, so much of this is around fit, around culture, around how do we talk about this? How do we feel comfortable? Well, if you never surround yourself with anyone that's different to you, you're never going to feel comfortable. So you need to find people you can talk to about it, who can help you with it, who have been through different experiences. You know, we talk about, don't we, organizations needing to be incredibly inclusive, culturally inclusive. Well, how can you be culturally inclusive if you've only got people from one part of one culture that work for you? You're not. You're culturally non-inclusive, actually. So it's very interesting as to what people even think about the words inclusion. But it is a tough subject to talk about. But we kind of need to get over ourselves a bit with it, really. There's a lot of other things that are tough in life, okay? If we want to crack race, talk about it, put a plan together, deliver on the plan. And, you know, I need to do delivery. I'm not really sure why we've spent so many years finding this so difficult. It's not a comfortable subject, but it's one which is easy to crack if we're prepared to. But boards today, if you've only ever surrounded yourself with people of one ethnicity, you can see why it's so hard for them to do. And now you're hearing boards starting to talk to individuals within their organizations of color, to try and get in their lived in experiences. And I'm sort of sitting there thinking, well, it's all very interesting. It's another 3 years of talking. Put the data in, put in a plan to change it, as you would with anything else you want to change in an organization. Stop thinking it's, you know, we seem to skirt around this one because this one's in the too difficult box. It's not. But of course it is, in the same way it was probably very difficult to a group of men many, many years ago, bearing in mind that the workplace was designed for men because very few women were in it. Sooner or later, they had to get used to changing it for women. It's exactly the same. We just need to get on with it.
Thank you. And Peter, any advice for how the profession can encourage leaders to get on with it? Because I think a lot of the data collection would end up in the HR to-do list.
I think it reinforces these points. So absolutely get the data. Where are we as an organization in terms of, you know, these aspects of diversity? But I absolutely agree with Ruby. You know, one of the first times I met you, you may remember we were doing a joint seminar with a D&I group at Ernst & Young, I think it was, EY. And I made that comment on the platform. I said, you know, it seems that it's very difficult to talk about race. And this black guy immediately stuck up his hand and said, no, for you, it is because you're white. For me, it's my lived experience. So I think what we have to encourage is let's get the data so we know where we're starting, and then open up the conversations we're all agreeing, which is to hear the lived experience, because so many people, this is why we talk about things like white privilege now, so many white people just do not understand the lived experience of people from ethnic minority backgrounds. And they should understand it. They should understand it in the context of their organization. So opening up those conversations, sharing experiences, what's working, what's not, what other things do we need to do? Should we be training our managers differently? How do we help our managers to be more comfortable talking about these subjects? Because it's not just about what I do, it's also permeating that through the organization. Those are all things which HR, of course, can encourage and support and should be. And so this becomes a front and center agenda for the organization, not just today, but for the long term as well. Because as we're all saying, this is as much about sustainable and responsible business as anything I can think of. Because the more inclusion and diversity you have, you break the group think, you bring the different experiences, you reflect the communities and customers of which you're part of. So let's never forget to link these ideas to the reason why it's important for business to take it forward as well, because it's also a truth that, you know, some people do think this is a compliance thing, or it's just a current fad, or whatever it might be. And I've heard many of those questions before too. So let's get the evidence of what we look like today, but also the evidence as to why this is important to support our businesses for the future.
Thank you. I can see a lot of the points around kind of moving to action are landing very well. People really behind that in the chat, and somebody's asked, once we run the report and potentially find an ethnicity pay gap, what steps can employers then take to address the data and close the gap? Doyin, thoughts from you?
Sure. I think I'd be repeating a couple of comments I made earlier, kind of blending also some of Peter's comments around analysis, asking questions. What is the data telling us about certain groups of people in certain parts of our business? And that would give us insights into the actions that need to be taken. So at senior levels, there is, for example, I talked about sponsorship, the power, the impact of sponsorship. Sponsorship is a senior white leader kind of putting their name on the line on behalf of someone who is underrepresented. If you find that at that level that you're not getting the senior level diversity that you want, then that is something that we know from the research works. It happens anyway in insider groups. This is just about saying, well, you know, put the effort in. It's a little bit more than a little effort to do it for people who are in your outsider group. It might be that you are finding that at lower levels, actually, there are particular communities who don't necessarily feel that this is the right organization for them. And that's one of the explanations of your pay gap. And so you think through, well, what are the ways in which we need to make sure, for example, at a team level, we are equipping managers with specific, practical, inclusive leadership practices so that they are tuning into the diversity of their of the talent at that level. So there's lots of different potential evidence-based actions that can be taken, and the ethnicity pay gap gives you additional data to pinpoint what is going on and how you can fix it, in addition to just paying people more, which you should pay people the same.
Thank you, Doyin. And Ruby, any thoughts from you on that? Perhaps anything that you did yourself as a CEO that worked?
I think one of the things we could all do is that one of the big areas which needs to change is the lack of sponsorship of individuals. So we all did well in our careers because people sponsored or supported us. For whatever reason, you know, two great CEOs supported me, helped me become chief executive. It didn't happen just because I happened to turn up and do well. It was, you know, there was a lot of work, a lot of support in that. Everyone needs support. If you think about anyone that gets promoted, they are put forward, they are mentored, they are supported. And what we need to do here is really think around sponsoring as a key element of trying to reduce that gap, as we have done with women. Because if we don't, then it's not going to change, because you can do all the nice stuff, but sponsoring really matters. And that will go down to, you know, organizations saying, we don't just want diverse shortlists, we want really good candidates. We want them to get to that interview for a promotion well prepared. And therefore, if they don't have access to the same support as others, we want to make sure that there's a level playing field by the time they get there. Quite often what's happening is individuals with a BAME background don't have the networks, don't get the support, therefore don't always get through the interview process because they don't know how to necessarily always get through that or to get that dream job. So sponsoring is going to be key. Everything around recruitment process has got to change, because if you don't have diverse groups of individuals who are going to interview you, and you don't have panels that are more diverse, then you put people at a massive disadvantage. We're only just getting there on, you know, diverse shortlists for women, but we certainly don't have them on BAME. And also it's around how you know, for me, it's all around how employees do get promoted. If it's the case that we're just not promoting those for BAME background, then we have to work out individually in each organisation what stops that individual. And part of it could be they're going to go and work for a team that just don't think they fit, whatever fit may mean. Fit's such an important part. You know, you've got to get on with people. But if you've never known anyone of this particular background who doesn't necessarily say, you know, who doesn't have the same interests as you, you get to an interview, you try and have a chat on how you build a relationship. it's quite difficult. So that means a huge amount of support and training for those in the organisation to say, look, you're going to have to get used to having different types of teams. It's not going to be we all go into a room and we can chat for 20 minutes about what we did at the weekend, because maybe none of us have got anything in common anymore, but that's okay. What we care about is we really care about what someone can contribute to the organisation. We don't need to have to, you know, because so much around building teams is around getting on and having shared interests. And, you know, and I remember going for my first interview at Mighty where the chairman asked me if I did hunting, shooting or fishing. And I said, you've got to be joking. I'm a girl from a state school in the north of London who didn't grow up without anything. I wouldn't even know where you start with those things. He kind of got over it in the end, but it was a key component for how he hired people. So we need to understand culturally these things happen and are happening all the time. And it's no different to a very male management team simply coming in on a Monday and talking about football. By the way, I lived with that for years. I hadn't got a clue what was going on, but you know, I just kind of listened to it for 10 minutes, but it didn't make me feel included. But I persevered, and it's about inclusion and about teams understanding. And by the way, senior teams of women may get this wrong because again they may be biased and want to talk about things the average guy doesn't want to talk about. So we have to think about behaviours in this as well.
Thank you, Ruby. I'm afraid we're out of time there, so I'm just going to quickly bring it to a close. Thank you so much, Ruby, Peter, Doyin, some really fabulous messages. I think the main takeaway for the audience is just do it, just get on with it. Let's do something and move from rhetoric to action. Thank you so much everyone for watching, for your comments, some really great comments going on in the chat, and for your questions as well. I think I covered as many of them as I could, and apologies if I didn't get to yours. We have one more webinar in this series. It's next Monday at the same time, 12:30. We're going to be looking at the role of employee networks and how businesses and HR can best support them. So please do join us for that. The webinar will be available to watch again if you want, or to share it with colleagues from this afternoon or tomorrow. And a reminder to look out for the CIPD Reward Management Survey, which includes some questions that are really relevant to today's discussion. I saw that my colleagues placed some of those in the chat. But that's it from us this afternoon. Thank you so much for watching and engaging, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.